Do you want to fill your prepper pantry with food you'll actually want to eat? Then stay tuned because this video is for you. Hey guys, it's Jara with Wicked Prepared. Welcome back to the channel. We have seen even more craziness in the world over the last week, am I right? And it's sure to keep escalating over the next several months. So it's no wonder that many people have really stepped up their prepping. When it comes to emergency food storage, there's a few issues that we see over and over again. Too many people stock their preps with foods that they think they should store, like beans, rice, canned tuna, things like that. But they give no thought to how they're actually going to turn those foods into a complete meal when the time comes. Or they stock up on so-called convenience items like these that are full of things that they really aren't keen on putting in their bodies. Because of these reasons, too many people don't rotate their emergency food storage like they should. And that food they spent their hard-earned money on just sits there until it's past dates, at which point most people just toss it. Food storage can be one of the best and smartest investments that we make, but only if it's done right. That's why we love using meals in a jar as part of our emergency food storage. We can make a huge variety of different meals that our family actually likes and wants to eat. Because we make them ourselves, we control what goes into them, so we know they're made with ingredients that we trust and they fit our dietary needs. They're shelf stable, so they can sit in our food storage for years if necessary, and they're ready when we need them. They don't require any additional ingredients besides water. Just add water. And most of them cook up pretty quickly and easily in an emergency. Best of all, because they're meals that we like and we feel good about the ingredients in them, we're more likely to pull them off the shelf when we need a quick, easy meal. That helps keep our food storage rotated so that nothing gets too old and there's no bad surprises when we finally go to use our emergency food. Not to mention, it helps keep us out of the drive-thru when we know we have better options at home that are healthier and probably just as quick or even quicker. You can see how meals in a jar tick all the boxes for us and why we love them so much. We have a whole collection of meal in a jar recipes on our channel and our website, but I try to come out with a new meal in a jar video for our followers at least once a month. Today's meal in a jar is a sausage lasagna skillet. This is a very simple, basic meal in a jar, so it's perfect if you're just beginning with meals in a jar. Let's get started and I'll show you how this meal is done. I said this was a great jar meal for beginners, for someone who's just starting out with jar meals, and this is why, because there's very few ingredients and they're very basic. We've got our pasta. I'm using Mafalda pasta, which is basically mini lasagna noodles. I have a really hard time finding this. I cannot find this anywhere near where I live, and I have a hard time finding it online for a decent price. So I've been getting it from Amazon. I will link where I get everything down in the description box below the video. But hopefully you have more luck finding this locally to you, and I'll show a few other options here in just a minute. I've got some sausage, freeze-dried sausage. Now this is another place that this is flexible. If you don't like sausage, you don't have sausage, you could use a freeze-dried Hamburg. And if you don't have either one of those and you don't have it in your budget to purchase those right now, because meats, of course, are a little bit more expensive in freeze-dried food, just like they are in fresh food or canned food. Any kind of food you're buying, meat is usually going to take the biggest bite out of the budget. This month, this freeze-dried sausage is on sale, and that's part of the reason that I've chosen this meal. I'm using a lot of ingredients that are on sale. That's the way I like to do it, so that I can stock up on things when they're on sale and make a lot of jar meals all at once. But if it's not in your budget to get freeze-dried meat right now, you could also use a TVP, a beef TVP. That's quite a bit less expensive. That's a meat substitute. It works a little bit differently than freeze-dried meats. It's going to absorb a lot more liquid and it's going to swell, so you would need to use less of it in the recipe, and you might need to adjust your water amounts, but it is a little bit more of a budget-friendly option if that's something that you need. And then we've got mozzarella cheese. This is freeze-dried mozzarella cheese, of course. This is another great item to have on hand because it's real cheese. A lot of times for prepper pantry, people feel like they're stuck with things like Velveeta, which is not real cheese and it's not a very healthy option. This is just pure real mozzarella cheese, shredded and freeze-dried. And then I've got tomato sauce powder. Now this is one of my most favorite products because it's very unique. I don't see a lot of spaghetti sauce. This is basically a spaghetti sauce powder. It's all seasoned, it's all ready to go, it's complete. You just add water and it thickens into a beautiful sauce. I've seen powdered mixes that you add to your own can of tomato sauce or tomato paste, but I've never seen a complete product like this. Just a couple other reasons why I love this product. It is a good space saver for me in my prepper pantry. It comes in a can like this, which is a quart-sized can, and the entire can fits in this little canister. So it's really about the size of one jar of spaghetti sauce, but this is going to take the place of several jars of spaghetti sauce with what you get out of it. There are 51 servings of spaghetti sauce in this can. So I love that it saves space, and the other thing I love is that I can make up as much or as little as I want. So like if you're a single person or you're a small family, or like me, maybe you have kids and teenagers who like to make themselves some pasta for a snack and open up a whole jar of sauce, use a little bit out of it, put it back in the fridge, and then never touch it again, and you end up finding a jar of 3/4 full with moldy sauce. This is a great option because you can mix up just one serving at a time, or 2 servings, or 4 or 8, or however many you want. So you can use exactly the amount that you want. And once it's opened, the contents of the can will stay good for about a year. So you have quite a while to use it up. And then other than those ingredients, I've just got some seasonings over here. I've got some Italian seasoning, just basic Italian seasoning. And I've got some sausage seasoning. These are meant for like people who are making their own sausage, but I use them a lot to add more of a sausage flavor. See, freeze-dried sausages are pretty mild in flavor, and they're kind of neither here nor there. They're so, they can appeal to everyone, and so they could be used for any type of meal, breakfast meal, dinner meal, Italian meal, any kind of sausage you need. So I like to add a little bit more flavor that's specific to the type of sausage that I want to be using. So I would be using an Italian sausage in a dish like this. So I use an Italian sausage seasoning. I'm just going to use one of these. I have sweet Italian sausage and mild Italian sausage. They're very similar. I'm not even really sure what the difference is between these two. There's also a hot Italian sausage seasoning, which I have used in the past sometimes, so you can choose whatever one you like. I will have links to these on Amazon because it's not something I've ever found in a local grocery store. And then, of course, I've got some Johnny's garlic. This is a really tasty seasoning, and it adds a really good kind of garlicky touch. Now, if you can't find the Mafalda pasta, like I said, I will link to this, but it's a little spendy where I've been getting it. It's more than I typically pay for pasta, but I do really like to have this shape if I'm making something like this, like a lasagna skillet or lasagna soup. I just like to have this shape of noodle. I've also found this one. It's called something else. It's called Reginetti, but I think that's just another name for Mafalda. You can see right there. And this one is a whole grain. So this was not any less expensive, but it is whole grain. So if you like using whole grains, like we like to do a lot, this is an option. This is also from Amazon. You could also use something like radiatore or bow ties. Any of these pasta shapes would work pretty well for a dish like this. You could use, sometimes you can find really wide, wavy egg noodle ribbons. I can't really find those close to me. I just have regular egg noodles. And I prefer something a little bit wider and wavier, but these two shapes I think would be nice in this lasagna skillet. You could also use something like this shape. I think these are called campanelles. They're like a trumpet-shaped pasta. I think that would work really well in a lasagna skillet. And all of these last 3 options that I showed you, I have found at my local grocery store. So you could probably find them at your local grocery store because clearly we don't have much in our area. The only caveat to that is if you do use a different pasta shape, you might have to adjust your cooking time, and you also might need to adjust the amount of water just slightly. You might need a little bit more water for some of the bulkier pasta types, and you might need a little longer cooking time, but that's pretty easy to figure out. To put together this meal, we're going to need a quart-sized mason jar. There's not a whole lot of special equipment needed for this, which is one of the great things about it. You don't need a pressure canner or anything like that. This is a wide mouth quart-sized mason jar. This is going to make it easier when it comes time to get your meal out of the jar. Trust me, you want the wide mouth. You want to have a sealing lid and ring to go with your jar. If you're putting this meal away for the long term, you're going to want to use an oxygen absorber. Some people do vacuum seal them. Personally, I think they last longer with an oxygen absorber, but people have had some pretty decent luck with their vacuum sealers as well. We're going to be using some basic measuring utensils, cups and spoons. And then the final thing we're going to want is a canning funnel to help us get the ingredients into the jar. Now let's get started. I'm going to start with my pasta. And I'm going to be adding 2 cups of my pasta. You can be a little bit generous on these cups. There's going to be plenty of room in the jar. And if at the end you have extra space, you could always add some more pasta if you want. Just keep in mind if you increase the amount of pasta, you might need to increase the amount of water just a tad. 1 cup and 2 cups. Next, I'm going to add my sausage. Now, I'm only using a half a cup of sausage. That's a little bit less than I typically put in a jar meal. Typically, it's 3/4 cup to a cup that I would use in a jar meal. But a great way to cut down the cost of any meal, and this includes meals that you make with fresh ingredients, is to cut down the amount of meat in the meal, because that's usually the most expensive portion of the meal. So you can see these are just little pieces of freeze-dried sausage. These are delicious. I actually love to eat them just dry, right out of the can or right out of the canister. If you eat keto or low carb, these are a great low carb snack. Sometimes I'll just eat them plain. Sometimes I make a little snack mix with the sausage and some freeze-dried shredded cheese. It's delicious. So I'm doing a half cup of the sausage. And next I'm going to add the tomato sauce. I'm also doing a half a cup of the tomato sauce powder. And you can see that that is seasoned. It's got all the seasonings that it needs. Everything is in this. It's complete. So a half a cup. And the thing with powdered ingredients is if you work them a little bit, you can get them to go down deeper into the jar and filter in amongst the other ingredients and take up less space in the jar. So you can really fit more than 4 cups worth of ingredients in these jars if you layer them just right and make things kind of fit together into the same layer. Next, I'm going to add my sausage seasoning. Remember, you can use sweet, mild, or hot Italian, whichever you like. If you don't have the seasoning, you don't want to purchase it, it's actually pretty inexpensive. But if you don't want to purchase it, you could just use some extra of the other seasonings that we're using. But I like that this gives it a sausage flavor, and a big part of the sausage flavor comes from fennel. There's a big taste of fennel in most Italian sausages. So if you didn't have this, you could use some fennel, either fennel seed or crushed fennel or ground fennel. This also has salt in it, these sausage seasonings. So if you need to avoid salt, you could substitute with some fennel and Italian seasonings and things to cut the salt out. I am using a teaspoon of the sausage seasoning. I'm using a half a teaspoon of this Johnny's garlic. And I'm also using a half a teaspoon of Italian seasoning. This dispenses a 1/4 teaspoon with each click of this dial. So I'm just going to do that instead of measuring. I don't know why I haven't put these other seasonings into dispensers like this. I just haven't yet. I actually have some empty ones on a brand new carousel that I could be filling up. So I need to get doing that because I really prefer this. It's a lot easier and it doesn't dirty up extra measuring utensils. All right, so that's our seasonings. And now all we have left to add is the mozzarella cheese. I am dividing this mozzarella cheese because I want some to be in the actual lasagna mixture. And then I want some that I'm gonna reserve to refresh and sprinkle on top to have that melty cheese on the top. So what I'm putting in the jar with the rest of the mixture is going to be a half a cup. And then I'm also gonna put in an additional half a cup. And I am going to put it in a baggie and just put it right inside the top of the jar here so that I can remove it when I go to prepare this and just keep it separate. I am using one of these fold top sandwich baggies that does not have the zipper section. And part of the reason, there's 2 reasons why I'm doing that. Number one, when it has that zipper portion that's kind of stiff, it makes it harder to fit the bag into the jar. It can be done usually if you have enough space. We have plenty of space here, but it's just kind of a pain. But the other reason is if I were to be putting this away for long term and adding an oxygen absorber, that oxygen absorber is going to react with the oxygen in the jar to basically eat it up and get rid of it. So if I were to put my cheese in here and seal it with a zipper, there would be some oxygen sealed in with the cheese in the baggie. So this way, the oxygen will be, I'll just kind of twist it shut, and so it's not going to be sealed real tight. And so everything would be able to be affected by the oxygen absorber. All right, so I'm just going to put my half a cup, an additional half a cup of mozzarella cheese into this baggie. And like I said, I'm just going to keep it loosely closed and just tuck it into the top here. And then if I were putting this away for the long term, I would add my oxygen absorber and go ahead and put my lid on tightly, and that would seal my jar up. But instead of putting this one away, I'm actually going to be fixing it up so you can see how it turns out. But first, because this is a very simple meal, I wanted to give you guys a little bit of something extra. So I'm going to do a couple of other jars of things that you could serve alongside this meal, especially because this meal doesn't have any vegetables in it to speak of really, other than obviously the tomatoes and the tomato sauce, which does count. But usually that's one of the things that I really love about meals in a jar is that I can add the veggies right in. So you can have everything you need for your meal right in the jar, including the veggies or fruit, your protein, everything else. In this case, I decided against adding veggies just because I just thought I would keep it really simple. If people were just starting out, this has few ingredients to purchase. If you have kids that don't like some of the veggies, it's very simple. If you wanted to add veggies to this, you absolutely could. You could add some freeze-dried chopped spinach. You could add some sliced mushrooms, bell peppers, whatever you like in your lasagna, you can go ahead and add. I just didn't personally. So I'm going to make a side dish, a vegetable side dish to go along in a jar. I'm going to do a seasoned green beans. For the seasoned green bean side dish, these are the ingredients I'm going to be using. I'm using some freeze-dried onion slices, of course, freeze-dried green beans. I'm using some butter powder, and this is the seasoning I'm going to be using. This is Kinder's The Blend, salt, pepper, and garlic, and we really, really like this. It's really tasty, and it goes great with the green beans. Now, if you are new to freeze-dried food and you're wondering what the fuss is all about, part of the reason that preppers love it so much and why it's great for meals in a jar is because freeze-dried food typically has about a 25-year shelf life. It has a very long shelf life. Despite that, the freeze-drying process is so gentle that it maintains almost 100% of the nutrients in the food. 95 to 98% of the nutrients in the fresh food are maintained in the freeze-dried product. So it's a very, very healthy option. The ones that we get have no GMOs in their products at all. They have very high quality standards, so they're just a great product. And then once you open up a freeze-dried product, the 25-year shelf life is sealed in the can when you get them. And then once you open them, you've usually typically got about a year to use them up. That can vary some depending on things like the humidity where you live and the conditions that you store them in. But typically about a year is what people get out of them after they're opened. And then of course, if you seal them back up in a jar with an oxygen absorber, you are going to maintain that long shelf life. Maybe not quite as long as they were in the original can, but most people tend to get at least between 5 to 8 years out of a jar meal minimum, depending on the ingredients they put in them and how they store them. And for this side dish, I'm going to be using a pint-sized jar. We don't need a whole quart for a side dish to go along with our meal. I'm going to use a pint. Once again, I'm going to be using a wide mouth pint. And all of the other equipment is going to be basically the same as our other jar meal. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to add to my jar is going to be the onion slices. These are just onions, freeze-dried onions that are a little bit larger than the chopped onions that you can get, which are much smaller little bits, but I wanted some larger pieces in this dish. I'm just going to add a 1/4 cup of the onion slices right into the bottom of the jar. And then I'm going to be adding my butter powder. I'm using a tablespoon of the butter powder. My seasoning next, I'm going to be using a teaspoon of this. And then I'm just going to go ahead and pack the rest of the jar with the green beans. I'm not even going to measure this. I really just need the jar filled up to the top with the green beans. You can tap these down, get more to fit. And then of course just leave room to put an oxygen absorber on the top once again if you're going to seal this up. I usually use 200 cc's in my quart jars, so I would think this would need about 100 cc's. And here is our seasoned green bean side dish, all ready to go with our lasagna skillet. I am going to give you one more thing to serve alongside the lasagna skillet, and that's going to be a super simple mini French bread loaf. This is such a simple recipe. You can see here there's only 3 ingredients. I've got bread flour, I've got salt, and I've got instant yeast. The only thing about this recipe that you need a lot of is time, because it does need some time for rising and some time for resting, but it's very simple and it makes a great thing to serve alongside our lasagna skillet. Let's get started. I am going to be making this spread mix in a pint-sized jar, and I'm using a wide mouth pint because all of the ingredients that go into this are powdered. It could certainly fit into a regular mouth pint jar, but just because I want all these elements to go together and I did the green beans in the wide mouth, I thought it would look good if it was uniform. So I'm going to be using a wide mouth pint jar this time and my trusty funnel, and I'm going to start with the bread flour. Now, bread flour really makes your bread have a better texture. It's just got extra gluten in it, I believe. But I have made bread with regular all-purpose flour before. I haven't tried this recipe with regular flour, but if that's all you have, it would probably work still pretty well. We're going to be adding 1 3/4 cups of flour, but I am going to put it in 2 parts. I'm going to put in the 1 cup first, and then I'm going to add my salt and then the rest of the flour, and then I'm going to add my yeast on top because we want to keep the salt and the yeast separate in this jar. We don't want them to be touching each other. And when I pour it out into the bowl to get it mixed and blended, I want them to start off separate. So that's why I'm putting the salt in the middle and not in the bottom of the jar, because when I pour it in the bowl, I usually do a circular motion. So the beginning of what I pour and the end of what I pour would be in the same place, if that makes any sense. Now, the best way to measure your flour, especially when you're baking bread, is to weigh it. And I actually got my Pantry Chic machine recently. You've probably seen that. It's a special machine with special canisters, and you put the canister right on top of the machine, and it measures out your ingredients, and it measures them by weight, and it's specifically made for that. Because when I first learned that it was best to measure your flour by weight, and I started doing that, I was doing it on a simple kitchen scale, which is, you know, a very inexpensive, simple way to do it. But I found I always had to look up what weight I was going for if I wanted a cup of flour, because I wasn't usually following recipes that were written by weight. So I was always having to look it up on the internet before I got started. And I just found that I just gave up doing it because it was such a pain. So when I saw that there was actually a machine that was meant for measuring your ingredients like that by weight, I was all over it. But I haven't gotten a canister yet for my bread flour. I have a canister for my all-purpose flour, and I have a canister for my semolina flour. I don't have a canister for the Pantry Chic for the bread flour. So for now, I'm just measuring this by hand. But the reason it's so important to measure your flour by weight is because depending on how you measure it in your cup, you could have vastly different amounts of flour in the same cup. If you were to scoop it like this, it packs it in, and there could be a lot more flour. Actually, you'd be surprised at how different the measurement could be than if you had spooned it in lightly. So the best way to measure flour, if you're not measuring it by weight, is to kind of fluff it up and just spoon it lightly into the cup like this, and then level it off rather than scooping your cup through the flour and packing it in. If you know that your flour is kind of packed already in the container, maybe you filled your container up and just had to smush the lid on, or it's been sitting a while, you can even run it through a sifter or just pass it through a wire mesh strainer to kind of fluff it up before you get started. So here's my first 1 cup. I'm going to put that in my jar. And now I'm going to go ahead and add my salt. And incidentally, this is my canister for my Pantry Chic, so I could put this on the Pantry Chic and it could measure the salt for me, but I'm not going to do that just because I'm not getting it out for the flour, so I'm not going to get it out just for the salt. I am adding 1 teaspoon of salt right there in the middle. And then I'm going to go ahead and add the rest of my flour, which is going to be 3/4 of a cup. So there's a 1/2 cup, covering up that salt. And then our last 1/4 cup. And you can see that fills it up pretty full. We've still got a little bit of space. The final ingredient for our bread is the instant yeast. Now, I store this in the freezer. Now, this is the one part I'm not 100% certain about because I haven't been doing breads in a jar like this long enough to have a lot of experience with how long the yeast will stay good. But it does help yeast to have an oxygen absorber. It'll help all of these ingredients. So if anybody out there has more experience than me with this, let us know your experience down in the comments of how long you have had your yeast last in a jar like this. The other thing you could do is you could include your yeast in a packet. You could include a packet of yeast so that you could test it, you know, before you made the bread, and then you could put fresh yeast in it if you had yeast and you needed to. But hopefully this will last at least a year on the shelf. I know a lot of people rotate through their meals and use these regularly around the house, and so, you know, theoretically, if this would last a year, say you were going to make 2 of these a month, you could store 24 jars of them and you would be using them up in a year, and as long as you're replacing them on the other end, you would maintain about a year's supply of bread. Here is my 1/2 teaspoon of yeast, instant yeast. Make sure it's instant yeast. And then the one last thing that I am going to include in this jar is I have got about a couple tablespoons of flour in another baggie. And the reason I'm doing this is for 2 reasons. Number one, you do need a little bit of flour to sprinkle over the top of the loaf before you bake it. And I'm probably going to sprinkle some on the bottom because you're supposed to have like cornmeal, coarse cornmeal or something, but I'm just going to use a little bit of flour. And the other thing is, if you are adding your liquid and you add a little bit too much, you might need a little bit of extra flour to kind of bring your dough back together, just in case. So it can't hurt to have this little packet of extra flour in there. Once again, if you were going to be storing this long term, you would use your oxygen absorber and seal it up, and our bread mix is ready to go. And then of course we're going to want some garlic butter spread to go along with our bread. Now there's two options here. This is another really simple recipe. There's only two ingredients, butter powder and the Johnny's garlic. Now you can fit all of the ingredients into this small 1/4 pint jar. It just barely fits, but it does fit. But I prefer to do it in this wide mouth 1/2 pint jar, and it won't fill the jar, but then when you go to use it, or whoever you give this to, you can mix it right up in this jar because there's enough room to add the water and mix. And it can be served out of this jar and stored in this jar if you have extra. So those are your two options. If you do it in this jar, it will fit, and then you would just put it into a separate dish to mix it up. I'm going to do it in this wide mouth 1/2 pint today. Like I mentioned, it is super simple. There's only two ingredients. I'm going to start with my butter powder, and I'm going to be using 1/2 cup of the butter powder. And then I'm going to be adding the Johnny's garlic. Now this, I'm going to be putting a tablespoon in here, which is what the package calls for 1/2 cup of butter. And we like it like this, but it's pretty strongly garlicky. So if you are not into garlic quite as much, you don't like things quite as strong, you might want to start out with maybe 1/2 tablespoon or 2 teaspoons at first and test that out and see how you like it. And then decide if you like it with that much or if you want more garlic before you make up a bunch of these. And there we go. The bread does take the longest to prepare because of the rising and resting time. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on that first. To make my little loaf of French bread, I am going to be using my food processor today. This is my new food processor that I just got, and it does have a dough hook, or a dough blade actually. This is called the dough blade. But the recipe that I adapted this from, she did it in a food processor with the regular steel blade. So if you don't have a dough blade for your food processor, you could use your regular steel blade. Now obviously if you're doing this in a situation when you don't have electricity, a power outage of some sort, you are probably not going to be using a food processor, and you will have to do the mixing and kneading by hand. It's super quick in the food processor. It only takes about 45 seconds. And when I got this food processor, I noticed it does a little countdown here, or it counts the seconds, and I never really thought about what that would be for until I was making the spread the other day, and I said, oh, that's really handy to have the seconds counting down. So I guess that's what it's for. All right, so I'm going to get ready to put my bread mix into the mixer. Now remember, I was careful to keep the salt and the yeast separated, and so I'm going to try to do the same when I add it to the bowl here. So I'm going to put it in a circular motion around here. I do have my water ready. This is just slightly warm tap water, and I've got 3/4 of a cup ready to go. You can just barely feel that it's warm. I also have some extra water set aside just in case I need it. I'm going to add most of what I have in the 3/4 cup, and if the dough doesn't look moist enough, or like there's still some dry flour left in the bottom, then I'll add a little bit more. All right, so I'll definitely remove the oxygen absorber, and I'm going to remove our little bag of flour that's just in there for the extra flour that we need. So I'm going to go ahead and pour this in. The lid on my processor. I do have my smallest pusher out. That's where I'm going to add my water. And you can see here where it does the countdown. So I'm going to start this mixing, and I'm just going to start slowly adding my water. Stop and take a look at that. Still have a little bit of flour going, so I'm just going to use this to scrape down the side a little bit. Because I'm doing such a small batch, a small loaf, this machine is probably a little bit big for it, but all right, I'm going to let this go. 45 seconds is what we want. That's just a little bit wetter than the last time I made it, but I think it's going to work just fine. So now I'm going to go ahead and get this dough out into a dry bowl. I just have a small plastic bowl here because it's a small loaf, and I'm going to put it in a warm place for 2 hours. Now for me, my warm place is going to be my oven. My oven light's been on some today, so the oven is warmer than the room temperature. So I haven't had my oven on at all. It's just a little bit warm from the light. So I'm going to go ahead and get this dough into the bowl and put it in there for 2 hours. All right, so I've got my dough here, and I have a piece of plastic wrap. I'm just going to cover this lightly with a piece of plastic wrap, and put it in my warm oven. Like I said, the oven has not been on. It's slightly warm from the light running. I'm going to put it in there for 2 hours and then I'll see you right back here. All right, now that our dough has been in the warm oven for 2 hours, you can see that it actually rose quite a bit. If it doesn't rise that much for you, that's okay. It doesn't have to double or anything like that. Now it calls for the dough to be turned out onto a floured surface. I am just going to use the same pan that I'm going to bake it on for everything else from here on out. So remember our little baggie of flour. Now this is part of what it is for. So for the floured surface, I'm just going to put some flour in here and flour our surface. So let's get this dough out of the bowl. And I am just going to kind of make this into a bun shape, a round shape, just so that it can sit on the sheet for a little bit longer and rest. All right, so now that I've got the bread dough on here, I'm just going to cover it again with this piece of plastic wrap. Now, you could use a kitchen towel for this, if that's what you have. Whatever you have will work. And now this is going to rest for 20 minutes. All right, so now it has been 20 minutes for this, and I'm going to just form it into a loaf shape. I'm going to dust some more of this flour over the top to make it easier to work with. The other thing I sometimes do is put oil on my hands. So if oil is something that you have on hand all the time, which for me it is something that I have on hand all the time. But you also can get olive oil packets, small olive oil packets from Amazon, and you could put an oil packet in the jar with the bread mix if you wanted to be able to have a little bit to oil your hands. Now I'm just doing this really, really roughly. I am not doing anything fancy here. I do want this to be a little bit more short and stout and not a really long and skinny loaf. But I'm going to call that good. So this is going to get dusted with a little more flour over the top. So now that this is shaped, I am going to cover this again, and it's going to sit for 40 more minutes before it bakes. And then the last thing I'm going to do is when it's close to the time that this is going to go in the oven, I am going to heat it to 400. I'm going to take a baking pan and put it on the bottom rack of the oven. And I'm going to have my tea kettle ready with some boiling water, because we're going to be having a pan of boiling water in the bottom of the oven with the bread. And that's going to help it develop more of a crustiness. But this is going to set for 40 minutes, and I'll see you back when that's up. All right, so my oven is set to 400. I've got a pan on the bottom rack, and I'm just going to fill it with some boiling water. Well, I don't need to fill it. That will be just fine. Right now, I'm just going to uncover this for the last time, and I'm going to make 3 slashes in the dough. And then this is going to go in the oven for 20 to 25 minutes at 400. And now the hardest part is that we have to let this beautiful loaf of bread cool down before we cut into it. And during the cooling process, we can prepare the rest of the meal. To prepare the lasagna skillet and the side dish to go with it, I'm going to use my butane emergency burner. But the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open this meal up, and I'm going to get out this little baggie of cheese, because I'm going to get this refreshing first. This was a half a cup of cheese, so it's only going to take about 1.5 tablespoons of water and about 15 minutes to refresh this into fresh cheese. I usually have a little bit of water left over, so I want to do this first, even though we're not going to use the cheese till the very end to sprinkle over the top of the dish, because if there's any water left, left over after refreshing the cheese, it's going to be kind of a milky water, and it'll be a really good addition to the water that we need for our recipe. So that's why I'm going to start this first. To refresh the cheese, like I said, I only want about 1.5 tablespoons of water, and we want cold water. We definitely want to use cold water for the cheese, or else we'll end up with a goopy mess. So I'm just going to do it right in this bag. It can be done in a bag, in a bowl. It's good in a small container with a lid, because then you can kind of tumble it around. But I can do it in this bag just as easily, and we won't be wasting an extra dish, which in an emergency would be a really important factor. I'm just drizzling this water over it. Trying to do it evenly, but it doesn't matter too much because we're going to toss it around in the bag. Right now I'm just going to set this aside and let this set and refresh for a few minutes. 15 minutes is about what it takes. All right, so the cheese has been setting, and it actually looks like I don't really have any extra water in here. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Likewise, if it doesn't seem like it's going to be getting refreshed all the way through, you can always add a little drizzle of extra water. And if you do have any water left over after it's refreshed, just add it into your dish. I have 3 cups of water. That's what we're going to be using for our meal. And just a regular skillet. I'd say this is probably a 12-inch skillet, I believe. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my meal and just pour it right on in here. And I'm going to add in my 3 cups of water. This is cold water. I'm going to give this a stir to moisten all the ingredients. And then I'm just going to let it set for about 5 or 10 minutes before I get it started. And that's just going to basically let the cheese that's in here start to refresh as well, because it melts better when it's refreshed, and it doesn't refresh well in hot water really. So it's going to be incorporated into the dish better if I let it set in the cold water for a little bit before I turn the burner on. All right, so just getting everything incorporated and then everything submerged in the liquid. And I'm going to let this set for 10 minutes. Okay, now that this is set just a little bit, it's going to be time to get the burner going. Got this on a medium-high heat, and I'm just going to bring this up to a simmer, and then I'm going to cover it and simmer it on low. It's not going to take very long. With this kind of pasta, I think it's usually about 8 to 10 minutes probably. Like I mentioned, if you switch out the pasta type, you might need to adjust your cooking time, and you might need to adjust your water amount slightly. All right, you can see this is starting to bubble here, so I am just going to give it another quick stir. I'm going to turn it down, and I'm going to put the lid on and let it simmer for a little bit. You definitely want to stir this occasionally to make sure that it doesn't stick onto the bottom. The hardest part with these butane burners is actually keeping the flame low enough, because they're pretty powerful. All right, it's been 8 minutes. This is starting to look pretty done. I'm just going to test one of these pastas. That's basically what you're looking for, is for the pasta to be done to your likeness. And you can check the meat too, but it should be done, you know, it should be refreshed all the way through by the time the noodles are done. Yeah, that is pretty much done. It is going to thicken up a little bit more as it sets. I'm going to turn the burner off, and then we need to sprinkle on our cheese. This is the cheese that we added the water to at the beginning to get it refreshing. All right, now that I've got all the cheese on there, I'm going to get this lid on so that it can start melting. There you go. Look at how beautiful that melted, just like real cheese, because guess what? It is real cheese. It just had all the water removed to make it shelf stable, and then we just put the water back, and voila, we had real mozzarella cheese again. So this skillet is ready to serve. I'm going to put it aside. It can cool a little bit. It's only going to take me a couple of minutes to whip up the seasoned green beans to go with it. All right, so for the seasoned green beans, I'm using a skillet that's just ever so slightly smaller than the one that I used before. So I'm going to open up my green beans, and I'm just going to dump the contents of the jar into the pan. And I've got 1 cup of water here, 1 cup of cold water. And a trick I like to sometimes use with meals in a jar, if there's any powder or seasoning or anything left in the jar, I just use the jar, the water to rinse it out, just so that we don't waste anything. And if you keep in mind, if you're in an emergency situation and you're low on, you know, things to cook with and measure with, usually mason jars are marked on the side with measurements for water. So now that I've got the water in here, I'm just going to give this a stir, try to kind of moisten everything and get the butter powder mixed in with the water as best I can. It's not going to completely mix while it's cold, but once we put the heat to it, it will. All right, that's good enough. I'm going to put the heat on. What I want to do is bring this up to a boil, basically a simmer, a strong simmer, and then I'm going to cover it to lock in the steam, and I'm going to let it go just for 1 minute, just to make sure that everything gets kind of steamed through. These green beans take no time to cook because they're freeze-dried. They really just need to refresh and get the water back into them. You could even just soak them in cold water and they would be ready. So I'm going to have them go for 1 minute with the lid on for the steam, and then I'm going to take that lid off, and we're just going to evaporate the rest of the water until they just saute in the remaining butter powder and seasoning, and then they'll be done. All right, you can see this is coming up to a boil. I'm going to cover it for 1 minute just to get those veggies steamed through. All right, there's 1 minute. Now I'm going to uncover this, and I am just going to toss these. Like I said, the water is going to evaporate. It's not going to take but a minute or two, and then these will just be like sauteed green beans. Just keep tossing them to make sure they all get even amounts of moisture. All right, so now that the water is dried up, that's really all we need. I'm going to go ahead and turn this off. Continue to toss them in the hot pan for just a minute. All right, so that is ready to serve along with our lasagna skillet. Got our green beans and our lasagna skillet, and the bread will be done shortly, and then we'll have our complete meal. The final thing that we need to do while the bread is finishing cooling is mix up the garlic butter spread. Now, like I mentioned, you can put this into a separate bowl and use a whisk if you'd like. I have done that, and that works really well, but I find it works just as well to mix it up with the knife or spreader that you're going to use, or a spoon, right in this jar, and just keep it all in this jar from start to finish. We're going to be using about 2 to 3 tablespoons of cold water. So I've got some cold water here, and I'm going to start with 2 tablespoons and just start mixing that and see if we need to add some more, which I think I probably will with this spread, but I am going to go ahead and add a little bit more. I'm not going to add a whole tablespoon at once. I probably will need it, but you can't go back, but you can always go a little further. I do think I'll add the rest of that 3rd tablespoon, and that should be good. But you can mix this up to whatever you consider a good spreading consistency. Just go slowly, little by little. All right, so there is our garlic butter all ready to go on our bread. Now, I did let the bread cool pretty much completely. I love slicing into a warm loaf of bread fresh out of the oven, but it's really not that great for the bread when we cut into it when it's super hot. So I did let this cool down. You can see where my slashes didn't really work out too well, but it still feels like a nice loaf of bread. I think this is a pretty forgiving recipe. And there is our rustic French bread. This is a very simple loaf of bread, but in an emergency, that's pretty much what we're going to want, is something very simple. Now, you can just spread the garlic butter spread on the bread, or you could always put it, give it a flash in the pan, or put it in the oven for a little bit, whatever you want, if you wanted to brown it up more like an actual garlic bread or garlic toast. But it's also very good just with this garlic butter. Like I mentioned, I did mix this up pretty strong with the garlic, so if you're not a big garlic fan, you might want to cut this down a little bit, the garlic spread that you put into the mix, and try it out, and if you think you could take a little bit more, you can always adjust it. All right, now all we have to do is add a slice of bread to our lovely meal, and this is all ready to serve. Look at that, what a beautiful meal. The beautiful thing about this is you can mix and match this. We've got our main dish here, we've got our veggie side, we've got our bread, but you could use this side with other meals. You could use different seasonings in the side. You could season this differently. You could use different seasonings in your butter spread. You could have a honey butter. If you check out my cornbread, just add water mix in a jar video, I have a honey butter spread done similarly to this. You could add cinnamon to that. You could do a lot with this basic bread dough. This is such a basic bread dough. You could have sandwiches with this. You could do anything you wanted. There's a lot of different options for all the parts of this meal. Enjoy! This meal was delicious and really easy to put together. The bread does take some time, but as long as you plan ahead, it's really very simple to prepare. Granted, in a grid down emergency, you would probably have to adjust how you go about preparing the bread, but it's a very basic bread recipe and a great item to have in your arsenal. My best advice for meals in a jar is to pick out a recipe that you want to try and then make one jar. Prepare that one jar and try it out. Feed it to your family. Make sure you like it. Everyone has different tastes, and what one person loves might just not be another person's cup of tea. Try the recipe and hopefully you love it as is, Or maybe there's a few things that you want to tweak with the seasonings, swap out a veggie ingredient for something else. Maybe you need to adjust something with the water amount or the cook time, especially if you live in an area with different humidity levels. If you make changes, note them down on your recipe so that you remember. And then once you're happy with the recipe, then you can make it up in bulk and really stock your shelves. It doesn't take much more time to make up 6, 10, or 12 jars than it does to make one when you line it up assembly line style. Then you can take advantage of sales and buying in bulk to save some money. You can get even more savings if you get together with a group of friends and have a meal in a jar party. Buy things by the case and split the cost. And you'll have fun and catch up while you do it. It depends on a lot of factors, but I typically get 3 to 4 servings out of a quart-sized jar meal. If you're typically only feeding 1 or 2 people, you can divide these recipes in half and make quart recipes in a pint, pint recipes in a half pint, and so on and so forth. When you do make my meal in a jar recipes, I would love it if you would come back to the video and leave a comment on it, or go to my Meal in a Jar Facebook group and post about it. I would love to see pictures of your jars, pictures of the prepared dish. I'd love to hear about any changes you made and how you liked it. I love hearing from you. All in all, these dishes I showed you today are 3 very simple dishes with relatively few ingredients, and if you happen to be seeing this when it comes out in July 2024, pretty much everything I used today is on sale this month, so it's a great time to fill your shelves with these jars. To keep up with what's on sale every month and get access to coupons and flash sales when they come out, text SALE to my number. I'm going to put it down on the screen here and in the video description, and I'll put you on my text alert list. I'll also tell you how to save 15% on non-sale items every single day. If you're interested in learning more about freeze-dried food and why so many people are so crazy about it, we actually have 2 events coming up in September that we're going to be at, and we would love to meet you there. These events are completely free, and they even feed you lunch for free, and you spend the morning learning all about freeze-dried food, all of its benefits, how to use it, how to cook with it, and you even get to try a few things. And on top of that, they even have giveaways during the event, so you could even win some free items. That's a lot of free, and we all know that's my favorite word. The 2 events coming up are in American Fork, Utah on September 14th and in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on September 21st. So if you live anywhere near those places, or if you're going to be traveling near those places in September, we would love to see you there. Text the word Philly or the word Utah to my number, that same number that I told you before, and we will keep you updated with more info as we get it. Don't forget to check out our Meal in a Jar playlist if you want to see some more amazing meals that you can get from a mason jar. And come on over and join my Meal in a Jar group on Facebook if you're not already a member there. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, leave me an Italian flag emoji down in the comments, and check out this video next for some more meals you can make with a lot of the same ingredients that I used today. I'm Jara with Wicked Prepared. Survive today, thrive tomorrow. We'll see you next time.